I like how it was instantaneous that time. I can't put this down now. The moment I put I'm just going to turn the mouse off. There you go. I am smart.
So, I'm curious whether you plan to... Our previous kind of brief interlude into the discussion was a bit of a pre-discussion regarding...
into the discussion before we even establish what we're doing.
Well, that my curiosity is, are you planning on jumping into the aforementioned discussion from last week where I was talking more about the occult side of things?
We never talked about this on air.
Well, I agree.
So this is my point. Are you launching in before we establish
No, but see, that's what I'm saying. These kinds of in the middle of the dialogue pique my interest.
Well, we didn't get that opportunity because you got mad at me for cheating.
What?
This is... Oh, well, I was going to say we're going to be able to hear it this time, but not really because I have to turn it down. This is a weird game that I pre-recorded because I wasn't sure it would work. But then I was like, it's subdued enough that it would work for a headier topic, which is why it's good that we have a headier topic today. But we're overdubbing this because I recorded it in an experimental run. And
it's also a heady enough topic that we probably ought to...
Oh goodness, this is louder than I thought.
Probably ought to have it overdubbed so that we're not having to...
Well, I had this thought anyways. It's just I find that when we're playing a new game, which is what this is, it's almost impossible to have a deeper discussion because the game we're trying to figure out what exactly the game even is.
I feel like something suffers. It's either, and this is true, I think, even within our play.
Well, I think if you're going to do, and I have other games that I've downloaded and not played, which I think let's make the discussion about them.
Sure.
One of them is one that I actually followed a long time ago when it was first announced. And I'm talking like years ago that I was very curious about, and then I'm thinking we'll end up discussing the game, not...
See, and there are times for that, I think.
Something else.
This is intriguing. I'm already my interest is piqued in this regard.
It's an interesting concept, but it's very much a sci-fi, very dense concept.
Is it executed well?
Well, I only played about the first hour of it. I think it's a small studio, so it's like... as far as execution, it's a little bit clunky, but not in a bad way, just in I think this was made by a couple friends way. Because essentially the plot of it is...
You cannot get you flashed.
We fell out of the sky for some unknown reason, but we are playing as the AI sort of helper assistant of this mechanized suit. It's sort of like a sci-fi militaristic thing.
Okay.
But we are unconscious. Like the person inside the suit has passed out from the impact. So we are actually playing as the robot controlling the suit, trying to get the pilot to
safety,
medical help.
Okay.
And I never got as far as achieving that, but so it's a little it's not the most, well, I was going to say it's not the most original plot, but I don't know that I could name anything else that's done it. I just feel like for some reason it's almost a writing prompt.
Huh.
Not to say that that's bad. A lot of times you can make something interesting.
Yeah, I was about to say. I mean, especially.
And there's definitely a couple moments where I was like, "Oh."
Writer yourself.
Well, there's moments that will come across that are like, "Oh, okay, that was creepy and unexpected." But
does it come off a bit of a Poe Lovecraftian vibes, or
much more sci-fi-ish?
Oh, okay.
I mean,
so a little bit more like who would be an example of that? I'm trying to think of more sci-fi.
Sci-fi. Well, maybe Dune-ish.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair.
I mean, that's giving this probably more credit than it's worth. As I said, I only played an hour, and Dune is like the Star Wars, or not Star Wars, is like the Lord of the Rings of sci-fi. So
sure.
That might be too generous a comparison, but I'm saying Dune has sci-fi and also weirdness. So it's not Lovecraftian weirdness, it's sort of space weirdness. Aliens weirdness, maybe.
Oh, there you go. So yeah,
but
back to the idea. Are you planning on jumping more in the previously discussed?
You act as though we teased what we're about.
No.
So I don't know.
But I'm saying directly to you. Are you wanting to go more the route of beginning there, or beginning about what we were talking about last night, which is a little bit more?
Are they not the same? I think they will be.
They will be.
They'll meet somewhere in the
middle. But I'm saying, where do you want to begin?
I don't know. Where do you want to begin?
Where does anybody begin? With the search for truth.
Well, that's unfortunate. I just bought this.
Well, I thought you were talking about the search for truth and being unfortunate.
It is usually.
That's certainly true.
Here's the weird. This is where the weirdness gets in. I remember this.
Okay.
As I was playing this, I was like,
How
okay.
very apropos.
Well, it doesn't. Sadly, it doesn't. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, this isn't like the plot of the game hinges around this. So it's
No,
not
but I'm
like-
just saying, so we're I know we've been rather cryptic up to this point, but
Well, it will stay that way, I assure you.
Wait,
Wait, us or the game?
no, I'm saying us.
Oh, okay, yes. No,
I
the
hope
game
not.
stays rather cryptic.
I'm just saying. So we last week off air we were discussing the possibility of maybe talking about some, not specifically deep dives, but more dipping toe into the concepts and some of the literature of the occult, not for the sake of practice, but just for the sake of knowledge. And
See, it wasn't even knowledge. It was more curiosity, because I feel like if it were
the
knowledge,
curiosity
it
makes
be...
it seem like you're somehow giving it thought as far as
No, curiosity is in
pursuit.
like, I don't know. Knowledge would be that. I'd say knowledge is far more serious than curiosity, because curiosity, you could be curious about something that is like frivolous.
Yeah, but I mean,
Knowledge is not frivolous.
knowledge. It certainly, but I feel like knowledge is a little bit more focused as to
Exactly,
why.
but that's my point. I'm not focused.
Yeah, but
It's more of a general, like,
I
what's
think
it all about?
Well, see, and
'Cause here's the thing,
that's
I feel
a
like if
dangerous
it were a
notion
real
to me,
thing-
if you're
If it were of true... If it were actually something that had substance to it, I feel like it wouldn't be looked at the way it is, because it's almost universally recognized as, like... No one... Well, I shouldn't say no one. There are people who take it seriously, but no one takes those people seriously, generally speaking.
I think you and I may be a little bit more divided than we thought.
Well, I was thinking...
Qualify that
Because
statement, because we're talking about the occult as a broad...
If the things that did the things that they claim to do, I think there would be more of like a thing about them. Like the church would get involved. None of the books that we're going to discuss are on the Catholic banned list, I don't think.
Well, that's certainly
And that's
true
kind of where I
maybe
go.
for
That
your
means that the
context.
church doesn't take this seriously.
That's certainly true for your context, where I
I should also look up, what's the
That's
name of the
where-
banned book list?
where I delved into the occult was far more in an actual praxis. Like, I mean, it was like, this is...
Well, that's not literature at that point.
Well, sure, but I'm saying that's true. But I'm just saying, like, I dived into like the pseudo theology of like Satanism and some of the other kind of, and interestingly enough,
Okay.
what?
Well, because the thing is...
Because if you're
Satanism
suggesting,
is a loaded term that there are people who call themselves that who are just atheists.
I 100% agree with that. Yes,
Whereas
I
then-
think it's become
and
a
that's
pop
a majority
culture
of
thing.
them where it's
I
like
100%
it's essentially
agree.
just the humanist religion.
I 100%
and they
agree
call
with
themselves that because it's edgy.
Yes, and I totally agree with that on a pop culture
Thanks,
level.
of course, to the Catholic Church for sounding exactly the way I expected.
What?
It is called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. So I'm like, well, thank you for being exactly what I thought you would be.
We might as well start with the Catholic Church. You and I both have a
I
similar.
don't feel like there's a start. That's not a starting point.
Well, not for the occult. That makes it sound like we think the Catholic Church is. No, Church capital C.
What is
Hereby
in
meaning the
Listed
United
what?
Church
Should
Catholic.
there's
Is
nothing in
something
there.
that you and I both had a fairly
That is funny for
big
different
agreement.
reasons.
What is-
Simone de Beauvoir is on this. The woman I talked about, who's the hideous feminist wretch.
They would have banned her.
Well, because it's literally like anti-natalism. It's literally like the human race deserves to die out.
Which
was
is-
her opinion.
Yeah, that's
which is like, I can see why the church was like, yeah, we're going to say no to that. See, contrary to popular misconception, the works of Charles Darwin were never included.
You know why?
Because the church is not as... John Milton? Not the famous... Not the work for which he's famous, I assume. Is Paradise Lost a banned book? That's like a Christian book. It's like banning Pilgrim's Progress.
I don't know. I mean,
Why was
don't-
he banned?
It's possible that it's on other theological matters. It's possible. But what I was saying was, you and I have both
This only lists
similar
authors.
and
This does not
agreed
actually-
upon opinion, which is that there is a bit of a subset, I would suppose, less maybe of a moderate view, but more of a extremist Protestant concept that states that somehow the Catholic Church is not saved somehow, or
Thomas Hobbes
is
surely not the Hobbes I have.
You'd be surprised, because you're talking about Hobbes and Locke kind of Hobbes, right?
And because it says all works, it's not just a specific work. What? That's weird to me.
I don't know. Well, Hobbes was the one that pushed more for the...
Well, you call him the sort of father of the...
socialist-ish...
No, it's very much the social contract.
But, I mean, that's certainly a... I can understand why it would be dangerous.
Now I'm a little bit annoyed. Well, because most of these are like the great works of the Western canon. Not most of these. Some of these are, like... Blaise Pascal, he was a mathematician. Like, what would he have written that would have offended the church?
You have to consider the fact that the Catholic
The Meditations of René Descartes. It's like, he was a Catholic.
But they have...
Mostly I'm just a little bit sad, because it's like, these are all books that I have spent a lot of time trying to get a hold of, because
the Catholics
Western,
have a very...
The Essays of Montaigne,
a very... What is it called?
Like, okay, Baruch Spinoza I've heard of, and I understand why he would be banned.
But they have to have a staunch view on... Because you think about... I think the reason that they're
Paradise Lost is on this list!
That is a...
They have to have a fairly
staunch... Yeah, but they have to have a fairly staunch view on what they allow to be...
I suppose Paradise Lost
contribution.
Paradise
you know what I mean?
Lost does contain a... It's not exactly a theology, because it is entirely... I don't think it was meant to be that, but it is a mythological interpretation, which the church would... It would make sense for them to say, we need to make it clear that this is not the
But
true...
you can't do that with everything, therefore they just say that literary context.
Well, then I suppose I would just wish for a little bit more nuance.
Well, but do you not know anything about the Catholic Church?
They're not devoid of nuance.
Makikaka.
No.
They're a little... I've always found that the United Church Catholic is very... I wouldn't even call them... On paper, they're very black and white. Now, it's possible in practice that they are not, but they are very black and white on paper. And it's certainly true that they're not in practice.
See, this is interesting, because, none of the books that I had heard of in this diversion are on that list. And so that's what now we've gone on a whole different tangent about why the Catholics apparently ban things that are pro-Catholic.
Or certainly...
That's
neo-Catholic.
Unless they were going to say Paradise Lost, if they were going to be like, we should make it clear that this is an allegorical story not meant to be interpreted as mythological fact. That would be honest, but to say don't read it,
allegory doesn't demand... Well, we'll get into that. But
this game, in watching it, this is going a lot faster than... I felt like this happened later, because I felt like it took me a while to get the grasp of some of these puzzles, but...
The allegory doesn't demand a...
This also, by the way, means we are on a time limit for this conversation.
Well, I was about to say...
Let's speed it up.
Yeah, we're going to have to be aware of that. So, anyway...
or we could just do what we did last week and talk for an hour after their screen's gone black.
Well, I mean... At that point...
We're only 14 minutes in, and I think I played it for at least a little more than an hour, so... Okay. 45 minutes. Speed your point.
Anyway, so we're within kind of the talking about the occult and things like that. I at least will talk about what initially piqued my interest with this. I had been doing a bit of poking around because I had differing opinions of various colleagues and within the context of my theological studies that have had differing opinions on the Freemason culture, and some say staunchly it's a cult, and then not a cult, but meaning a cult. Like
I was going to say, by definition, it is a cult of a sort.
Yes, but I mean like actual.
But technically speaking, the Amish are a cult.
Yeah, but I mean like they're meaning.
You're thinking cult versus a cult. Let's probably need to enunciate.
Yes. Better. Versus others that
occult,
exactly occult.
A cult.
But then other colleagues that would have said, "Oh no, it's just a social club that's highly shrouded in secrecy, and therefore it's misunderstood, or it's not not."
Because there is a bit of nuance. Where it's like I don't think the Bilderberg group would qualify as a cult. That's just a social.
Sure.
Now they have,
but at the same time,
pseudo mythology about them, but I don't think they promoted any of it.
But the difference is, and as I really did do more of a deep dive into things, basically what they say is, if you're on the bottom rung of some of the Freemason stuff, you may not know what you're getting yourself into. But on a little bit, but on the high end of things, it's straight up Satanism in disguise. And I didn't believe that at first until I was watching and doing more research on this.
You would have to have strong support from the person making that claim.
Yeah, there is. There's quite a few.
You'd have to be like, I left and here's what I know.
No, that was his. He was a 32nd degree, and there's only 33.
That's the credibility.
But also he actually quotes from like direct people, both historically within the Freemasons.
And you know this person, or you just
I read.
Called him a colleague.
No. These colleagues are others that initially got me thinking about the topic. No, he's not.
We're missing all of the interesting. I had a spook moment where there's this creepy figure in the background, and I paused for several seconds.
Well,
sorry to this game. I mean, we basically started with the presupposition that this game wasn't interesting enough to feel bad talking over it, and for the most part, that's kind of true. I don't mean to be rude to them, but it's a little just sort of generic. It's basically a point-and-click adventure at this point. It seems.
Well, that's I kind of made the joke about that you cannot get your flask.
There's combat gets involved later when other robots are around, but yeah. Sorry to whoever made this. It's not bad, but we're more interested in what we're talking about today.
Boris, try that. No, my point is he at least initially got me thinking about the topic, and then I ended up finding literature and various just.
But he himself had this testimony of like he had been a part of it.
No, not my colleague.
Oh.
No,
then who was it that was?
It was a documentary I watched on a guy that was basically coming out as a previous Freemason.
See, that gives the credibility I was asking for.
But at the same time, there was also others that there was just articles of direct quotes of like both historical and current context of like, hey, this is what we're doing and this is what we're after and things like that. To the point that as I got done with all of that kind of deep dive, not only was I convinced that that's certainly true, that essentially Freemasonry has certainly been a proponent of the spread of a lot of occult practices under the table or behind the scenes, which is a shame because what they do is essentially they use one hand with all of this kind of charitable giving and all this other stuff to make it look like they do great stuff, but then on the other hand they're doing all this stuff behind the scenes.
Well, Hollywood does the same thing.
Well, and Hollywood is a large part of kind of it. It's a bit of initially it kind of struck me as a conspiracy theory until I got into the deep dive of it and I'm going, okay, there's a lot of correlation here and various things. Now, I'm not a numerologist within biblical context, although I do think that...
does that even qualify as a cult? That to me is the kind of stuff that qualifies as quackery.
No, but it's not quackery as much as it is like heresy. I mean, there's times that like it's like no, that's heretical.
But the church doesn't believe it's heresy. It just would call it quackery because it's not bad.
Maybe
that's my opinion. It's like if the church itself is like we don't consider this enough of a threat to make a stand. I'm like then it must not have any prominence.
I don't agree because I think that they're using the Catholic Church as the only metric for that is a bit one-dimensional. Because there's certainly...
It is the only unified church with that kind of authority.
A Protestant
denomination might have its own stance, but that does not speak for all Protestantism.
That's certainly
Whereas
true.
The opinion of the Catholic Church does, by definition, speak for all Catholic churches.
That's certainly true, but it does not therefore mean that those subsets ought be nullified as far as experience and or validity of, hey, we've had encounters on the spiritual level, on the spiritual plane, and this is some of the things that we've been dealing with, and here's how we've handled it. I mean, that's to disregard that simply because the Catholic Church has less literature on it is a bit...
No, I'm saying the Catholic Church has a list of books that it deems to be heretical and
well, but you're strictly focusing on literature,
actually,
go ahead and dive into kind of more your side of things.
About, what are you... You're talking...
Because my point is, I talked about initially where it kind of ended up was, okay, not only is Satanism a very real thing, it's also
But again, are we talking about the human,
like actual Satanism, not humanistic?
See,
I would say people that.
Are you sure though? Because one video that we talked about was there was a guy whose whole YouTube channel is like he discusses the concept of the kind of meme concept of the iceberg, of the notion of the kind of rabbit trail that exists within very specific niche topics.
Sure.
So, like, one of them was he had a whole video that was called the cult iceberg, which is basically at the top there's the stuff everybody knows about, like Scientology. Yes, it's a cult and everyone knows about it. It's whack. But the stuff that people don't know about is the weirder, creepier, seedier stuff. Well, not just
creepy, but I mean, like, straight up demonic.
And his whole thing was talking about how the concept of the true Satanism is actually quite rare.
True.
Whereas most of the things that call themselves Satanists are basically just the secular humanist. I totally agree. Elevated to the level of religion.
I totally agree.
They would in fact say that they don't even believe in Satan as a true figure.
I agree.
They simply call it that.
I'm talking about the lower end of the iceberg. And
you're suggesting that that's what
Freemasons at the higher level are. Like, I'm talking like blood sacrifice. I'm talking like actual like sexual promiscuity to the point of like, oh, we're having a what is it called,
because I would have thought with Freemasonry's stated public opinions,
I agree.
It seems like it would have leaned more to the we're about exalting ourselves, which is evil in its own way.
I understand that, but I think what is interesting, and this is where Heiser comes in later.
Well, you have not talked about him yet.
Yeah, and I know, but the notion for me that left to our own devices, specifically within that kind of context of secular humanism, you're going to find that power and that kind of control draws you in and is exciting and
whoops. Do not look behind the curtain. I turned off the thing specifically so that it wouldn't do that, and then I hit the keyboard anyway. So now you can put the keyboard away. You didn't see anything.
Okay.
I'm not actually going to edit that out. I don't care. But
so the notion that the occult behind the scenes is actually like ritualistic and things like that all of that is actually present within not only Freemasonry but within, like, this is where I go, you can get a little tangential here where it feels a little bit global conspiracy theory, but I go, okay, but the problem is if there's validity across the board to all of this connection of...
Well, to say across the board, I think, is where you'd introduce the
meaning across the board of multiple, like, across the world, not just strictly...
Well, Freemasonry isn't across the world.
It is, 100%. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
It's a very American notion, or very British American
yes,
notion.
but it is... They have...
Are there Freemasonry clubs in Russia?
Israel. Yeah, 100%.
Well, okay, Israel Western. I'm talking about Eastern things.
No, but I'm talking like there may be fewer and far between in other countries, but they are there. And I'm just... What my interest was not strictly associated with the Freemasons. Once I got into it, I started going, wow, the occult at large, it's interesting how many things can be occult without appearing to be on the outside. In other words, they kind of
very nature.
Right. Well, and that's where I go.
Maybe that's precisely why the stuff that I found isn't, because it's so on the nose that no one takes it seriously, because it isn't.
And so go ahead and jump. I think that's a good way that you can jump in.
Well, this is odd because you got into it from a far more serious, like,
I did.
academic. I got into it entirely because it started initially as a curiosity about the concept of Lovecraft and like the Necronomicon.
Right.
Because that's, of course, a famous fictional occult text. And I was mostly
fascinating.
I was mostly just curious because, admittedly, this began almost as originally a test, because as I talked about originally, I was messing with the sort of AI algorithm search engines that now are popular, and I was mostly just trying to like test what are their capabilities. Because I find that the people who try to get into philosophical debates with them, I'm like, I think some people take too much out of them because they're like, oh, listen to all these things it said. And I'm like, yeah, but you're feeding it those things. by the very nature of you asking it these questions.
What are they trying to? What's profound about that? Is all I'm
that's
wondering.
why I don't know. That's why I admit I'm much more skeptical about the whole thing, because I'm like, it's essentially, as far as I've interacted with it, a hyperly intelligent search engine.
Oh, 100%. That's what it is. How could it be anything more than that?
Yeah, this could be a whole other discussion, because I think not enough people take the Chinese room paradox seriously. Which is where I'm like, because that's all it is.
Yeah.
It's a highly sophisticated Chinese room, and the whole point of that thought experiment is, would you be able to tell? The answer is no.
Right, exactly.
Of course, that's the point of the Chinese room, is that you wouldn't be able to tell. So, but anyways, that's a whole other can of worms. But anyways, what I was doing is I was like, I'm curious to see what are its capabilities, because of course Google wouldn't be able to give you these kinds of answers. And I was basically treating it as like a hyper-sophisticated Google, where I was like, okay, I gave it the basic synopsis of like, this is what the Necronomicon is within the Lovecraft. Are there any texts in the real world that possess such a reputation? And it basically said no.
Which is
true. It was like, this is a fictional work. There are no fictional works that achieve that level of hubbub, for lack of a better term. But there are works that are like in that direction, and it was basically a bunch of these like ancient Jewish, basically like, here's a list of, and I didn't ask for like transcripts, of course. I've not read any of these things.
Sure. But
it was just like, here's a list of books that are of similar
and reputation. It didn't bring of. Well, here's one of my questions, because there's certainly like actual witchcraft books that are 100% valid. I mean, like it's
but the thing is, they're not published. They're sort of things people write themselves.
They are, though. You can get a hold of them. I mean, it's maybe not like you're going to find them in a Barnes and Noble, but
obviously, but that's the case with the Necronomicon too. But the Necronomicon, my point about the Necronomicon as my basis was, is there a text not known to the masses, but known to anyone who is into this?
Right.
And that's where I go, there isn't, at least as far as this algorithm was able to produce. Because the thing about the Necronomicon is anyone who's remotely interested in Lovecraft's world. In the diegetically speaking, in the world of Lovecraft, which is ostensibly the real world but isn't.
Sure.
Anyone who's remotely interested in the cosmic forces knows about the Necronomicon. Like, literally all the people in Lovecraft's books either own the Necronomicon or know of it, because that's their whole thing. And I'm saying there does not appear to be, at least as far as I was able to find, an equivalent for, like, if you're interested in witchcraft, all of us own this book.
I think there are seminal works within...
Well, I mean, you could... But see, then you've got, like, okay, yes, you've got the works of Aleister Crowley, which most people take to be a quack.
He was totally not. Not a quack at all. Certainly not devoid of all... Here's the thing. It's quackery to assume that mankind or that humans by any means can control the supernatural realm. That's certainly quackery. But to say that Aleister Crowley had no...
I'm not suggesting that he was like a charlatan who knew it was all fake. I'm not...
I believe that he believed it. He had... No. But I'm talking like he had some next level demonic power. And I'm not saying...
But did he though?
He did. He 100%
what proof is there
did.
Of this?
There's
they all
testimonials.
Seem like claims.
His daughter...
Well, testimonials of...
No. So his daughter actually ended up running away from their home and ended up getting saved, taken in by this pastoral family that had to deal with kind of the backlash on a demonic level of all of that she had going on, because of the fact that obviously she was a part of all these rituals and things like that, but she literally had been set aside for what Crowley literally told them that she was supposed to be chosen as like the bride of the beast, and so there's this kind of context in which and again, this is within the charismatic kind of church.
This is where the dividing line is, that it seems to be purely the charismatic churches that take stances against this.
The
fact that the Catholic Church doesn't, kind of voice where I have to go,
oh, they 100% do.
None of his stuff is on this list.
But I'm saying, look at any. Why is it that
obviously
Catholics
they would never promote him? They
but
would
I'm
say
saying,
he's
why
a
is it
sinner and
that
a wicked
Catholics
man.
have what is it called? Exorcisms and things like that. It's because they know the demonic world does exist,
yes,
and that
but
it's
see,
100% powerful.
But this is precisely my point. Is this is exactly you've just hit upon my point, which is they do actually deal with this stuff. And they did not deal with him, which implies that they didn't consider him to have any actual credibility.
And I disagree. I don't think that it's that they didn't feel like they may not have had maybe as... I would argue, if it were me...
You can't argue that it was resources. They could have taken care of it if they felt the need to.
I think it was because of resources that Aleister Crowley never even attempted. Why wouldn't you try to pick on some, charismatic within the context of a small church or whatever else than to, specifically with his daughter that had run off and become saved essentially. And there was all this kind of manifestation, and he literally almost got taken to prison because at one point she, on a manifestation level, said the spirit, the demon in her essentially said that the pastor was abusing her and all these other things, and called 911 and did all this stuff. Well, it's like, okay, now I've got people at my door trying to take me to prison, and I literally had to have people that are on the police force that know me because they go to my church going, no, I don't think that's actually what happened, and this chick has a history of mental health issues. We've got to actually wait and give some credibility to this. So there is a demonic realm that 100% does act. Now, do I think that Crowley had any actual control of that realm? No. I think that he was obviously a puppet in the same way that any other human thinks that they have the ability to control and manipulate the dark arts, and they go, well, but you're just misguided because you don't understand that by the end of your days you're going to find your demise with the very thing that you but I mean, I'm talking like, so Crowley actually ended up dying. You can look this up. He ended up dying in this context. He was literally trying to curse this family with the dark arts or whatever, within the dark arts, was trying to curse this family, and basically told them by this time Halloween, I think it was 98, I want to say, by this time during Halloween.
1998?
Yeah.
He was far older than that.
Then it had to have been
1898.
No, it wasn't that long ago.
It was not recent.
It was not that long ago.
I'm gonna look this up because he was not around in 1998. He died, I thought, like hundreds of years, or like 800 years
I don't
ago.
think it was that far long ago.
I thought it was at least the 1800s.
But the context was that he literally passed away. I
have no clue how you spell Alistair.
Because of like some pulmonary embolism or something of that nature. But it's because this pastor got a word from the Lord that he ought to pray in this particular context.
1875 to 1947.
1947. So maybe it was in the 40s. But see, that doesn't make any sense because this was that would.
He's also British, by the way. So you talk about charismatic, he'd be an Anglican, or the church of the time would have been Anglican. Or is this a student of his, maybe, or
it's possible? But all that to say that, to me, the demonic realm 100% does exist.
I've never claimed the opposite.
No, I know, but I guess I'm wanting to clarify. Because witchcraft does exist too, and I think that there are this notion that witches and warlocks have authority through the demonic realm to actually actuate or manipulate things within the spiritual realm. I think that's true. Now, my issue is when you start getting into that, you don't realize that what you're doing is actually surrendering yourself to something you don't understand. And I do think that that's the truth. In the same way that I think prayer and being empowered by the Holy Spirit does the same for somebody who's serving the Lord. Do I think that it happens the way that most charismatics describe it? Maybe not, because I have some divide in that I'm not quite as sensational with my practice, but I do think very clearly in the book of Acts you get that the early church was supposed to be empowered for ministry within the context of the Holy Spirit, and that you see healings and the Holy Spirit actuating through humans frequently, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because I'm
not disagreeing with any of this. I'm simply saying that the literature that's out there, I'm not sure is as tied to it as it claims to be. Because I can't help but feel that if it was, there would be far more backlash against it.
I think if I could posit that there are certain things I don't think that the Catholic Church ought ban, I suppose, because it's a bit obvious. Like, I mean, don't read the, I can't remember what the particular author was, but like the fundamental, spell book of witches and warlocks, because the fact that it's a bad book to read. It's like, well, duh.
Yeah, but the Catholics are quite litigious, so it wouldn't have stopped them to be like, well, this is obvious. They did a lot of obvious things back then.
Sure, but I mean, that doesn't change the fact that... Is that...
The combat has now begun.
Oh, well, there you go. That was about the only exciting part of the game.
Yeah, it's a little bit clunky. Again, the game, it's sort of just like a modern point and click, which it has its moments, but again, this is why we chose it so we can talk over it. Again, sorry to whoever made this.
So, I will simply assert there are texts that contain divination, spells, things that you can do that I do think have validity. In the same way that if you buy a Ouija board, but you are actually intending to use it for the purpose of contacting and being connected with the demonic and the realm of the occult, you're going to succeed, because I think that they do use those tools. Now, do I think that they are directly tied to those tools? No. Do I think that they are manipulated by means of being forced into that kind of, almost like, to me it's not formulaic. In other words, yes, somebody said, I have this book of the dark arts written down and here's some spells and things like that. Now, these spells may communicate or open yourself up to a particular demonic connection, but to me, they're not bound to that. In other words, humans have no control over that, other than that the demonic have chosen to fool humankind into thinking that they have any sort of ability to actually control it. Mm. So, in the same way that it would be, like, it's actually a benefit to them to have that kind of literature out there, because what it does is people start then fooling around with these things.
Well, but this is precisely my point, is that the church would, if that were true, the church would have to have a stance on it.
I see, and I don't...
You're saying beneficial. You're saying something beneficial for dark powers, or whatever you mean by that. That seems like the kind of thing the church would have to say, we're going to say no to this.
I agree, but I don't think that the absence of their response, I don't think...
I agree. There's definitely a fallacy of the argument of silence. I agree that that's not a foolproof thing.
I don't disagree with you that you'd think that the response... Here's two different ways people can take that. Now, the latter is one I don't specifically ascribe to. The former would be they don't address it because they address it within other contexts, such as, exorcisms and things of that nature, and people that actually are studied in that. And I'd be curious actually what some of the most prolific, Catholic exorcists would say about these things.
People that talked about that. There's interviews.
So again,
I believe Michael Knowles even did an interview with a
right, and I recall that interview, but I am curious because I know that they give validity to these texts as well. I just don't think maybe they're written down within the larger Catholic narrative, because I don't think that most people would come in connection with those things unless they were intentionally looking for the occult, because we're stupid and we put our noses where they don't most people wouldn't. But I think the other thing is, the other kind of perspective on this would be that the Catholic Church and the organized religion at large has also been hijacked, and so therefore that's is a conspiratorial. And that much I agree with you and concur with you, that I think to suggest that somehow God hasn't been able to protect the established church well enough to stave off the occult from it, I think is a bit naive. So
I mean, the idea of corruption, that always occurs in any human institution, so that much you could say, but that's not conspiratorial, that's just natural entropy of all human enterprise.
Right. So I guess all that to say, we've kind of dipped our toes both in various contexts in this, but again, more on different sides of the equation. For me, I did very much look at it in more of the context of, okay, what's the validity of this? Where are the texts of these things? What's fascinating is in learning about kind of some of the behind the scenes of even like Freemasonry and things like that, texts, you know how like your search engines will begin to be familiar with the things that you've searched recently and things like that. So I came across then multiple books that, like, one of them was called Awakening Freemasonry or something like that, and it was written, I can't remember what the author was, but basically it said applying Freemasonry in the not supernatural, I don't think it used that phrase, but like in this religious sense. And then it actually said practicing the art of the craft. And I was like, that is a fascinatingly weird way of wording that. And it's because it's they 100% behind the scenes on the higher up levels do witchcraft, like straight up witchcraft. Now, do I think again that it has the ability to control and manipulate things that are within the realm of, like, as a believer, I think that the demonic can only control external things around me, because I don't think that I've been bought. I have a connection and a belonging and an adoption to the Lord that guarantees my safety to a degree, but I don't think that they can't manipulate things in the physical realm. I think that they certainly can take on physical form at times. I think they can manipulate people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. I think that there's now...
See, that, I don't know that I buy that, because I think that there always has to be an element of acceptance to it.
I agree.
In the same way that it's like people always make the claim that it's like, you know, if couldn't God just save all people? It's like, well, yes, he would have to override their will at that point. And I don't believe he does that.
I agree.
It's not necessary, and I don't think any supernatural thing can override the will of the people involved in it. Explicitly. Because I think that there are people who can be mistaken, which is when, I mean, we haven't even touched on my whole perspective of the subconscious element of it, because I think people can... You are not always acting in the way you think you are, subconsciously speaking. So to say, like, well, I didn't intend for this, it's like, no, consciously you weren't aware of it, but yes, you intended for this.
Sure.
Because you opened the door.
Sure. 100%.
You don't get to claim that wasn't intentional, it just wasn't conscious.
Right. Agreed.
And that's where so that's what I mean. I'm not saying that, like, it's impossible for them to, but I mean,
so that's
what I mean by the overriding of
I'm going to introduce a concept to you that I think is going to maybe clarify some of my recent theological disparity that has been resolved through Mike. So his name is Michael S. Heiser, sorry. Brilliant theologian that I've read before, but I didn't really give a lot of thought to. Not that I didn't give him credulity, but he's just a bit of a fringer as far as theology goes. But fascinatingly enough, So he's an Old Testament biblical theologian, which, for those of you that don't understand the nuance and the difference in those things, there's historical theologians, or there's historical theology, there's biblical theology, there's systematic theology. Those are the kind of three main subsets. Systematic theology tries to succinctly compile broad brushstroke theology across the Bible. Historical theology typically is dealing with the historicity of texts and the canonization of them and all of the other stuff. Mostly, I mean, they do deal with like some of the historicity of like early Bible and what's going on with that and those types of things, but really all of it comes back to when's the text, and within the history of actual documented written language, where does all this fit? The biblical theologians pull almost exclusively from the original languages of Hebrew and Greek and try to say, okay, what's here in the text? How did the original readers understand it when the writer was writing it? What was he or she intending? And then, from there, how can we actually get the meaning of what we need? And one of the things Heiser says that I found fascinating, and this will kind of, if we have time for this, I don't know, we may have to end up punting this other part to
13-ish minutes.
Okay, so maybe we'll punt this.
My whole other topic is basically
part.
It's different enough. It's become clear that it's different enough that it could be totally separate.
So we'll maybe say that for a different video. But Heiser talks about.
Well, perhaps I shouldn't take up the limited time with a meta theory. So never mind. I was going to comment on what we're actually doing rather than what we're talking about. But since we're limited time, let's not.
Okay. Heiser basically says, within the fall of the angelic hosts, and I'm going to clarify that statement because a lot of people have misconceptions about when that happened and how and all that sort of stuff.
Well, because is that not extra biblical? The Bible itself.
I will talk to you about how it's extra biblical. You're not wrong, but here's the clarification.
That doesn't mean false.
I agree. The time of the Nephilim, when they came down and engaged in sexual relations with the daughters of men, I believe that is really when the majority of the heavenly hosts actually deviated from God's plan. And a lot of people think, and it's completely it's actually completely what's the word for it?
Parabiblical?
Maybe, to suggest that with Satan and his fall, or the devil, or the deceiver, or whatever you want to call him, and his fall, a third of the angels went with him. That's nowhere in the biblical text ever.
Well, in terms of those numbers.
Well, not only those numbers, but there's nothing to suggest that somehow he had any clout to bring multiple angelic hosts with him.
Am I thinking correctly? There's a passage in Daniel which describes, because the Bible does acknowledge Lucifer as a character.
Correct. It does.
And I believe that's in Daniel, isn't it?
I don't know when the first time that it's quoted.
It's not anywhere in Genesis. It's not part of the founding narrative. It's something explored much later. I remember that being kind of odd.
Agree, but I also think that it's in Genesis in different contexts, and this is where we'll get into the fact that I agree with you that allegory in Genesis is 100% true. But I'll qualify it.
You can't say 100% true allegory. You mean that's a valid interpretation?
No, it's that the Genesis narrative specifically, and I'm going to clarify, specifically within creation, is
there not some academic reasoning that suggests that the first several chapters of Genesis are of such a different writing structure that they were not written by whoever wrote the later half of Genesis,
Correct.
which is generally considered to be Moses?
Correct. I'm more in the notion that Moses was maybe the original author and that it was actually edited and
Genesis
finalized.
history, as in Abraham thereon.
Right.
Which is chapters like 20 something. It's late in Genesis.
So within the context of the interaction with the Nephilim and the daughters of men, that's to me when there was an actual walking away of the angelic hosts in that regard. Now that's significant because those angelic hosts then became obviously the Elohim that walked away.
There is a word for this whole parabiblical...
My pilot has been
Is there not a
pseudepigrapha / apocrypha? Those two.
No, I'm saying there is a term for the whole concept of like the classification of angelic beings. Is there not a name for that?
I
figured you would have known.
Yes, I do. I did know it at one point.
There's
I don't remember.
It's obviously not Christology because that refers to Christ, but it's something similar. It's like something theology.
I don't remember what it is. But it would be the theology of angels and demons. Look that up.
Well, I'm sure that's what it would be described as.
No, I'm saying that I know that'll give you the actual correct word. But anyway, the bottom line is they were Elohim. Now, the original Hebrew writers use that word and they attribute that to both God
and that's not it.
And angelic hosts. And so at this point, these demons or these, which really angels and demons is a concept that comes from the Septuagint, arguably. The Greeks were the ones that actually gave them a little bit more black and white, like these are angels and these are demons.
Well, does it not come from the fact that Deimos is the Greek god of dread or something like that?
Yeah, it's a little more, again, the Greeks were trying to draw a little bit more clear and staunch parallels between the two, but the bottom line is these angelic hosts walked away from God's original design by interacting sexually with the daughters of men. Now, because of that, now let's jump forward to the tower.
This isn't giving me names, it's just giving me articles about the subject.
This is where I will be a little bit more... I'll clarify my point about why I think that there is power and validity to the spiritual realm within both evil and good, is that... Military machine, no more. You are Eric. So during the Tower of Babel, when or Babel, depending on your particular theological bend. I think that's a bit of a nuance, but the reality was, if you look at Psalms, and I can't remember which passage it is, I'll have to actually find that for you maybe if we revisit this discussion, but there's a passage in Psalms that basically talks about God punishing the sons of God that walked away, or that the gods of the nations kind of thing. And when God divided up the nations from in the Tower of Babel in their various languages, some interpretations have said, and he divided them up among the 12 tribes or among the tribes of Israel or something like that. Well, that's actually not the original text.
Call it angelology, which I know is not the word.
No, it's not, because I know which word you're thinking of, and it's not that. So,
I believe this is when...
So, anyway, the context of why I think there is validity to it is when what the actual text says in the original Hebrew is that God divided them up to each one correlating to the sons of God, meaning, and this is actually, to me, it totally makes sense to the theology and what I believe of God, which is that he surrendered those nations within the Tower of Babel. He surrendered various people groups and nations to lesser gods, the lesser angelic hosts, if you will, that had walked away from him, in order to say, okay, so you guys now are responsible for these people groups. They can worship you, they can do whatever, but the bottom line is I'm taking them back from you and I'm going to restore this, and it's going to be restored back to me. And so what's fascinating about the biblical narrative within the Tower of Babel is that for a time, God literally turned over groups of people over to the lesser gods. Now that challenges a lot of people's theology, but it's 100% sound within the original Hebrew understanding of what the Elohim meant, which was basically angelic hosts or spiritual realm, because they even used that term to describe disembodied people, like people that had passed on. They called them Elohim, which basically meant they just have gone to the spiritual realm. So basically what God was saying in that moment is, I'm turning these nations over to the powers that have already walked away from me within the spiritual realm. What I find fascinating about that is, to me, that is why these other gods. You take like the prophets of Baal and even like the Egyptian gods and some of these other places where we, Babylon, for instance, where we see these other gods being worshipped, and you go, the reason that those people obviously weren't just bat skates out of their mind. The issue was that those spiritual powers maybe didn't have the same authority, because obviously everything was authored and created by God Almighty, Yahweh, but they still had power because they are.
See, that's where
are extra.
This is where I take not issue, but I think that there has to be a separation between the mythology of these cultures and whatever spiritual powers existed within them at the time, because I don't think that they inherently overlap.
Oh, I don't think that they...
Because, like, to suggest that Ra actually was a being who had physical power, it's like...
I don't think...
There may have been a thing that they gave that name, maybe, but there also is, I think, perfect validity in the idea that this was simply... Mythology is a thing humans create in every culture.
It's a both and to me. I agree with you. It's not directly correlative, but what I'm saying is there was likely demonic activity and spirituality too within the spiritual realm that gave credibility to that. Does that make sense? Within that people group set, all of a sudden now these people have interacted with the spiritual realm and had actual experiences.
But that's still implying that the spiritual realm came first, but I'm not even sure that would need be the case, because I think people create mythologies wherever they go.
I agree, but I think that the spiritual realm does and has always been interacting with the physical realm since the dawn of time.
But I'm simply saying I don't know that it was... Somebody had an experience and then came up with the mythology to explain it.
I agree with you.
The mythology may have existed.
100% agree with you. But I think that then, take the demonic activity. I think then as a angelic host who's walked away from the Lord, of course you'd manipulate that. Why not? Yeah. Why wouldn't you? And so,
this is also, I should say again, none of these things are necessarily my opinions. My opinion is far more nebulous about all this. I'm simply proposing this.
Nebulous. What do you mean? Like you're just
I don't know what my opinion truly is, because I think they all need to be... The thing about all this is none of it's provable, which of course means that there isn't a right opinion. You basically have to say, I'm going to adopt this framework and explore how far it can reach.
Agreed.
And if I reach something it can't explain, then I'll perhaps adopt a different framework.
And I will say that within the past week and a half, 2 weeks, I have actually adjusted my own theological basis for an understanding because of the fact that I have delved into some of these things. Before... I wasn't comfortable with the notion. It made total sense to me once I actually looked at the Hebrew understanding culturally of... How much time do we have left?
If it goes into the black for a few minutes, that's not a problem. We are basically at the end, I know, but I think I went for at least an hour, so... But there's at least a couple minutes left, maybe?
The notion of... I never gave credibility to the notion that there were... other gods outside of God, Yahweh God, the God, the one that we consider to be Adonai, that kind of thing. But that's not how the Hebrews saw it. And when I originally looked at that, I was like, the Jewish and Hebrew culture did not agree with that. And it makes so much more sense that you would have all these cultures that considered multiple gods and all these other things if their context was that any sort of heavenly angelic beings were lower and lesser level gods. And it also makes sense.
It's a matter of language. You could say that they're nothing more than spirits.
Well, I agree, but think about the notion of how that makes sense to, like, even the context of, you have Zeus and then the lesser gods and things like that.
The Greeks I will take somewhat issue with, if only because I think they're, with the Greeks specifically, and this largely comes from Jordan Peterson's lectures, their mythology aligns so closely with archetypal frameworks that I feel like of all mythologies, theirs probably is the most non-religious. Which is odd, because they, of course, it was religious. They did actually have practices.
That may be true, but it was ultimately Mesopotamian in nature.
No, the Greeks.
I'm saying ancient Mesopotamia and how it then kind of spread out among...
See, I would disagree, because from what I understand of the Mesopotamian religion, that's nothing to do with how the Mesopotamian origin of the gods, their explanation for how they came to be, does not align with anything of the Greek. The Greek is almost archetypal from the outset.
Yes,
at least
but where do those archetypes come from? Is all
human experience. That I think is where
but that human experience started with oral tradition predating text is all I'm saying. And when I go back to the Tower of Babel, I go, before the Tower of Babel, everyone had the same oral tradition. Now, when the Tower of Babel split everybody, that oral tradition
is not entirely...
That's 100% a fact. That's an unequivocal fact that
Well, no, because
before.
again, but that would necessitate the belief that the Tower of Babel was not an allegorical story.
I agree, but I think that's...
So I'm simply saying that if we talked about the concept of early Genesis being, at least, it's not contra-biblical to view it allegorically.
Here's what I'm going to say. There's two types of...
would object to that claim.
Yes, they would be...
Which, by the way, like Origen and Augustine were like foundational church fathers were not opposed to allegorical.
What's interesting, though, is that what, and I'm going to challenge...
by the way, I'm not suggesting I think it is entirely allegorical.
No, but I'm going to thread a needle here.
Your argument necessitates it, which means that if you did take the opposite view, it couldn't.
It necessitates what... So there's two types of allegory. There's allegory of idea, which is most of the time how Jordan Peterson and some of the like apply that. There's also historical and political allegory, because allegory does not demand that the stories are not untrue. They're representative of the facts. Does that make sense?
Yes, but again, that would imply that like the Tower of Babel may well have occurred in an area, but that does not mean all people on Earth lived in that area at that time. That would be the issue. I'm simply saying that you have to square that hole. Again, I'm not saying it can't be squared, but I'm merely attempting to say, if you're going down this is the luggage you must take down that road with you, and you must be willing to take it.
I agree. To me, because I would consider it to be historical allegory, I do think that Adam and Eve actually existed. I do think that there was a heavenly being that was represented. What's interesting, so this is going to get a bit more technical for just a second.
Have that much time,
I know.
So.
It's going to get a bit more technical just for a second, but the serpent narrative, you and I talked about the fact that there's no
indication in the Bible
that it was a snake. But
it does say a snake, doesn't it?
It says serpent. But what's interesting about what's interesting about that is
or a lizard, I suppose.
There's three different understandings of that in the original text. There's serpent, physical. There's a noun that's applied
to a physical snake,
right? And well, I mean, it's a snake, serpent, something of that.
So biologically speaking, a serpent is. I don't think there are any things in the serpent family that aren't snakes.
Yes, but
with the exception of maybe some forms of lizard.
The word that is used is nahas in the Hebrew.
And is the other opportunity a metaphysical like serpent? In the same way that you could call someone a snake and mean that
right? So that there's a verb that means there's a verb that means the deceiver, essentially, which applies. And then there's another kind of... it's a secondary noun that basically means the liar or the accuser. It's similar. But what I'm saying is, it may not have been that particular heavenly host at that moment had the identification of Satan or the devil or whatever else, but
because that comes from Paradise Lost of all things.
But in doing that and making that choice, he set himself up as the chief of the resistance, if you will, or the primary resistance to what God's plan was at the time.
And is there any credence to the wild card thought, again, not ascribing any belief to this, but simply throwing it out as like, did it have to be a separate entity at all? Because if you take that kind of the deceiver, you could, does that require that it be an actual external entity, or could that have been again, allegorical?
I think that it was, and this is the reason, and this is a fascinating thought because Heiser touches on this. If you are going to construct a biblical worldview, you must start with the biblical narrative in mind. And therefore, if you go, I believe it's 2 John. I want to say it's 2 John. He discusses that the serpent in the garden, and then he identifies the serpent in the garden, and then he says the deceiver the devil, Satan, what he lists those things. Now, what's interesting is he says the context in which he frames that, he basically says that figure that has been then called this. So what he essentially ascribes is not this person was what he's not telling his readers is that I'm reading Genesis 1 and going, oh, that's Satan, that's what it says. What he's saying is that
the
character has
deceit
become has become the devil, has become
and that is obvious, if only because of the fact that, like, if you look at the etymology of the word Satan, it's like that comes from Set in Egypt.
But my point is...
So the idea is that, obviously, but this is where I think the archetypal rears its head, is because that explains it by saying, okay, it doesn't have to be an external thing first. It can become an external thing simply because the spirit of deception, let's give it the broadest possible brushstroke, has been called multiple things in multiple cultures because the spirit of deception exists within...
I agree, but my point is...
humanity, even.
I totally agree with that. But then that comes back to the Tower of Babel narrative, and for me, that really helped me...
I fail to see why you keep redounding to that.
Because here's the thing. The oral tradition before that point would have understood the context and the stories within the Garden of Eden that did exist. Again, I think it's historical allegory. So I think the point of Genesis, as you're reading through the beginning first couple chapters, are not... The biblical writers were... It's a polemic, first of all. If you don't... It's a polemic to a lot of the Babylonian narrative, because the actual redaction and editing, therefore the canonization of the Genesis, Exodus, the original Pentateuch, was... by most scholars' estimation, was done during the Babylonian exile. And so, within that context...
So that would be in Jewish tradition, then,
correct.
You have to say.
And so, within that context...
That makes sense, of course.
It's a polemic. So, it is a response from the Hebrew writers to say, okay, I'm writing this, obviously, to essentially set the record straight. Which is why I think it's not unfair to say they certainly were reading in some of their own... They were using parallels to Babylonian theology and things like that intentionally to set it up in opposition or in parallel to what their readers would have understood. But I don't think that negates the fact that the oral tradition leading up to before the Tower of Babel
the Jewish exile in Babylon was like centuries after Babel.
After Babel, agreed. But my point is, if all of those then various fractal nations started their own religion and understanding based on what they knew of that tiny moment in the garden, and
from what we know of the Tower of Babel, there's no indication that they were all one.
Yes, because they all came from the authorship and the family of Adam and Eve.
This is where another question arises, which is that when Cain is sent away, he goes to other tribes. Who were they?
I don't, and I gather that there was obviously more family and context within the nation of, or within the context of be fruitful and multiply. I think a couple of things. Number one,
I mean, that's of course possible, but then you go, okay, why did we only get 3 of the named children of Adam and Eve if they had like dozens?
Because the bloodline is a significant...
they would have all been part of the bloodline.
Yes, but...
And there were other people that left? Who does he go to? Because he goes to other people, and they are described as having already been there.
Yes, I think then you get into a bit of the... There's a Semitic set that basically believes that God created this other people group after the fall of Satan, and then like Satan took one of them to be his bride, and there's just the whole it's crazy. But
I don't think that explains it. I mean,
I agree. I agree. What I'm saying is I think in reading through the Genesis narrative, and I guess I'll close with this because I know we need to probably revisit this in a different context, but.
Well, mine is separate enough that I don't mind talking about it separately.
Historical allegory basically says the characters that are present are true characters that did exist. Timetables and actual literary, the way that I do read Genesis literally, but what I mean by that is I read it literarily. It's not a wooden kind of, if the Bible says that it was 6 days, then it has to be 6 days, therefore 6,000 years is as old as the earth. It can't be any older. I'm not one of those people that reads it like that. But I do think that it is allegorical in that, or historical allegory in that the characters did exist. If we, again, are to trust the Bible within John's context, do we believe that John had it correct when he says the deceiver, Satan, he's been called by many names, but applies it to a spiritual being and says that he's going to be, dealt with along with all of the sons of God who walked away? Are we to believe that that's true? Because if we start from a biblical worldview and perspective, and we're building our theology around that, we have to then say that character did exist, and then Set and all these other, contexts within various subcultures, of course, were understood in various ways because of the fact that with the Tower of Babel scattering language.
Well, but this is where I mainly draw perhaps my point of why I don't know that it's necessary to insist upon a unity when I don't know that it inherently has to be united to explain, is because, for example, every culture has a flood myth. Mm-hmm. But I don't necessarily think that therefore all cultures experienced the flood simultaneously. It simply could mean that all cultures have experienced a flood of cataclysmic nature, so that stories arise around them.
But what's
that doesn't
more
mean that they all... I don't think either is less likely when viewed on the grand time scale. It's sort of... here's my opinion. This is not at all dissimilar... it's dissimilar, of course, in scope, but not in kind. I think there is very strong reason to believe that dragons may, in fact, have existed.
I told my
every
son
culture
that recently
has myths of dragons.
100% agree.
And these would have been at times when these cultures had no connection.
Agreed.
But this doesn't mean that they're like all cultures have, like to suggest that. Because it was
only one dragon.
It was one, or like there was only dragons in this one area, and then people spread and they carried that message. It's like not necessarily.
That's true, but at the same time,
I think that allegories or mythology or archetypes arise by nature of the fact that they are natural phenomena.
I agree with that to a certain extent. I think that to me, it's much more logical to suggest that within the early context of pre-written language, when oral tradition was... Because if you look at the oral tradition, especially within the early context of history, the way that it was passed before the written language, oral tradition, we almost look, in our modern context, we almost spit in the face of oral tradition, like, well, there's no way to verify it, and how are you supposed to... And the reality was... Oral tradition was highly regarded and also very guarded. It was like you had to retell things
and people,
to the exact
people whose
level.
jobs it were to do that.
Right, exactly. And so to me, I go...
Who were no different than like librarians.
Right, but I go...
Keepers of the stories.
If you think about the notion that all of these people groups... If you start with the context that all these people groups at one point did experience this thing, and then they got dispersed in this time of the Tower of Babel, to me it makes sense that... I'm not suggesting that it
doesn't track. I'm simply saying that I think the nature of archetype, by definition, that it does not need...
It doesn't
you could
demand
argue that it does not stem... When I say it doesn't stem from the same source, I mean instance versus kind. As in... and that's not the right philosophical term, because the opposite of instance is, I guess, more form, you could say.
Form.
So
form rather than kind. Yeah.
All archetypes, you might say, every culture that has the archetype of the trickster god, because they all do.
Sure.
Are they all referring back to when we were all one people in Babel, we knew of this character, and therefore we just have different names? Or is it? I think, that's valid, but I think that it is equally as compelling to suggest, given the unknown time scale, that the concept of the trickster, be it a spiritual entity or not, is an archetype that people will encounter despite being separated by generations and distance.
That's also certainly
So the
true.
idea that you could have Loki be he would redound to the form but not the instance, if you understand philosophically what I mean by that distinction. So it's not to say that Loki is just another name for Set, who are both gods of chaos.
Sure.
But rather, and by
They're
which I
both
mean they do not
representative.
both stem back to the same god of chaos in quotation marks.
Right.
But rather they are both gods of chaos archetypally. And the
Sure.
cultures don't have had to have interacted to have such a concept, because that's a natural concept of experience.
I agree, but that only, I think, only in that I think
To attack me.
Sorry.
you are experiencing it whether,
You're registered as false.
and this kind of gets back to that your subconscious versus conscious thing, which is
Well, that will be that.
You're- you're
suppose-
either experiencing it
Remove.
in the physical world, in that, Adam and Eve, if we're to believe the garden narrative on a historical allegory level, that at one point there was there was a time that the god or the creator of this world did interact and actually live among the people that he created, and then there was this heavenly host that basically didn't want that to be the case, and so he set himself up against that notion and took offense to that to a degree. And so you go, either that was experienced directly, or, as you said, the context of
Just like
I require
humankind experiencing a similar
nation and
welcome to domestic.
thing, which of course all of us have experienced, the tensions of the deceiver of truth within our own
Well, and this
narrative.
is so. I suppose we could go on forever with this. So I will end with a teaser of not my opinion, but a line of thought that I think at least deserves examination. Because again, I can't.
Orbit protocol.
I'm not claiming belief in any of the things I'm saying. I'm merely exploring them because I think they need exploration.
there is
The argument could be made potentially
testing
that this deceiver you describe as an external source could also be
message rule. I will
the spirit of deception that dwells within a disintegrated soul. Because because essentially my argument boils down to, at its most basic, would be, is this deceiver an external source that causes us to deceive, or are we simply deceptive by our fallen nature?